Coming to you live from the Cultural Hall, this is the Mormon News Report for the week of November 20th, 2017. We are your weekly dose of Mormonism.
With a healthy dose of snark, because we all know we could use a little bit more of this in our lives. Life is too short to not take things too seriously.
You know, especially as we're getting into the holiday season, right, Brant? I mean, we need a little bit of snark. We need to lighten it up a little bit.
Of course. Like, for example, Brian, here's a healthy dose of snark that I was having with my wife last night. We got into a fervent argument on, is Die Hard a Christmas movie or not? And she thought I was being snarky, and I was like, no, I'm being completely serious. It is one of the best Christmas movies ever made. Of course it's a Christmas movie. Right?
No, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, he's got a Santa hat at some point, doesn't he?
And her argument was, it's not a Christmas movie if it just takes place during Christmas, to which I was like, that's a Christmas movie.
Well,
that's totally a Christmas movie.
Right. I mean, how many movies did you have to knock out of the pool if that was the case? Gremlins?
I know,
right?
Like, well, I mean, It's a Wonderful Life is gone, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, jeez. Hey, you know, this is what I say. If there's snow in the movie, it's a Christmas movie.
Argument ended. Case dismissed. We're good.
Right. Hey, you know what? We got a great show lined up for our listeners today. Podcaster Rick Bennett is going to be stopping by to discuss his podcast, Gospel Tangents, where he interviews, well, some of the best scholars, historians, and personalities in Mormonism, to be quite frank.
So, Brian, I do this weird thing. It's probably about a once a month thing. And I've been doing it. I'm not kidding you, everyone. I've been doing this for probably 7 to 10 years now, where once a month I'll go on iTunes or wherever, and I'll just search for a Mormon podcast because I'm really intrigued with all the different things that are out there. And I was struck by some of the names and topics I saw on Rick's podcast. For example, there's an entire interview series on the Mark Hoffman bombings with Kurt Bench. And there was another series on Blacks and Mormonism with Paul Reeve, discussing a lot about his book and some of the stuff going on in 1800s Utah. There's Book of Mormon DNA with Ugo Perego, and he does these long-form interviews that are chopped up into these 10-minute segments. So if you're the type of person who doesn't like, 3-hour-long podcasts, although I know that's really trendy within Mormonism right now, you can listen to those, or you could do like I do and just let them all build up and just binge an entire interview session. If anything, guys, think about it this way. We are recommending a friendly competitor. So, he must be doing something good.
And he also puts out his podcast as printed form too. So if you prefer to read as opposed to listening to the podcast, which I don't know anybody who does that anymore, but
come on, reading,
it is available there in that format.
And Brian, I will also add too, I believe he puts his interviews out on YouTube as well. So he video records them. So you can, if you're the type of person who likes to watch it, he's got it there as well.
He's got all sorts of options. Although I have to say that I'm glad that we don't video record. We don't need people watching us.
No, we've talked about it before. No one needs to see what my basement looks like. No one needs to see what I look like when we're recording. So
no one needs to see the early 1990s piece of exercise equipment that I have sitting behind me.
That's probably got cobwebs and is being used as a laundry drying rack.
Makes a great clothes hanger.
We'd like to welcome onto the show Rick Bennett. Rick is the host of the Gospel Tangents podcast, who has interviewed such luminaries as Dr. Paul Reeve on Blacks and Mormonism, Dr. Mark Staker on the history of Kirtland, Kurt Bench on the Mark Hoffman bombings, Brian Hales on Joseph Smith's polygamy, Jim Van Cannon, counselor in the First Presidency of the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Ann Wild on modern Mormon polygamy, and Greg Prince on gays, LDS leadership, and the priesthood. Rick has been running his podcast since 2017, and you can find all of his interviews in podcast form. You can find them on YouTube in video form, or, and this is something really unique, Rick, you could purchase transcripts of all of his interviews via Amazon or via his website. Rick, welcome onto the show.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
So, Rick, I got to ask you, What got you into this podcasting game? I mean, I think we can all agree it certainly wasn't the money. It wasn't because, this podcasting thing is easy to do. What was it that drew you to Mormon podcasting?
I think my wife asked that question too, actually. So I don't know. I've just honestly been interested in Mormon history. I've kind of been on the Bloggernacle for about 10 years, and I just thought, you know what? This is something I want to do, so I just went for it.
So where have you, for example, what started this whole thing? You started the podcast back in 2017. You said you've been on the Bloggernacle for about 10 years. Was it something that you've always thought about in your mind, or was there some impetus that you said, all right, I got to do this?
I've always been a little bit interested. Right after I got married in 2000 was when I got married. We did a tour of the Nauvoo Temple and hit a lot of the historic sites there. And I just kind of fell in love with Nauvoo. I just thought it was really awesome. And that was kind of my first dip my toe into church history and doing some of the sites. And it's just been something that's been interesting to me for a long time. And I don't know. I just finally decided, you know what, I'm going to give this a try and we'll see what happens.
So you said you've been following the Bloggernacle since about for about 10 years. So probably back to about, 2007-ish?
Right.
So what are some of the changes that you've seen both in the Mormon podcasting world and in the Bloggernacle world in the past 10 years?
Well, pretty much the first podcaster that I think anybody knew was John DeLynn, and he did that for quite a while. And then, Dan Witherspoon kind of took off with Mormon Matters. And, now it seems like in the last year or two, there have been a lot more. We've got Mormon News Report. Laura Hales has hers at LDS Perspectives. Lindsay Hanson Park, is that her name? Anyway, she's got Year of Polygamy. And there's just a lot of them. It seems like we're kind of multiplying. And, like you said, there's not a lot of money in this, but it's fun. And I think, if you have a passion, hopefully that comes out in the podcast.
Yeah, I think you're right. So I got bitten by the podcasting bug probably in about 2005-ish. I tried to do like an amateur podcast for something I was working on. I don't remember very many details, or maybe I blocked it out of my mind because it was those early recordings were that awful. But it seemed like in 2007 we were going through this like Mormon. Well, the Bloggernacles were huge in 2007. And podcasting was new and people really liked the idea. And if you ever search through iTunes, you could find a whole bunch of ones that were like, we kind of got some here and some here. And then they all just kind of dropped after a year. And I remember doing a lot of podcasting back in 2010 and 2011. Again, we hit another big peak where everyone was doing a podcast and then they dropped off. And now we're in this other peak in 2017. And I've got to wonder, I think a big factor in that is the barriers to entry are so much less, and podcasting is so much more comprehensible to more people. My parents, I don't want to make any of our older listeners feel bad. My parents are close to 70, and they were telling me about the fact that they're listening to podcasts now, which blew my mind. It's almost like podcasting is more accessible to people. Do you think that played a factor in making this, renaissance that we're seeing in 2017?
Yeah, I guess. I know, I listen to several podcasts, not necessarily just Mormon ones, and I've kind of tried to take some of the things that I like from some of these other ones and utilize them in my podcast. But I know one of them is Blueberry Podcast, and they've just said there's something going on about right now that it just seems like everybody's doing it. You don't have to explain what a podcast is. Most people know what it is now. And it's not just in Mormonism, but there's been a lot of new podcasts in a lot of places.
So what's been, and I know this is a question I know that everybody hates. What's been your favorite interview so far? And not favorite as in like, I really like the guy, but the interview that you came out of there and said, wow, I got the most content out of this one that I don't think anyone else has ever heard.
So it's kind of a nice way of saying, who's your favorite kid?
I didn't want to say that, but that's kind of what I'm thinking a little bit.
Well, I have to say every single person I interview, I always go in there thinking, I know a lot about Mormon history, and I try to research well. But every single time I come away from an interviewing going, wow, I didn't know that. But, I think, and it was actually one of my first interviews, you mentioned it with Mark Staker. He said two things that blew my mind. And in fact, and I know I don't have the best audio on that. Those were some of my first ones. But I was like, are you serious? And that was when he told me, because part of the reason I interviewed him was wanted to talk about Black Pete. And Mark's done a lot of work in Kirtland. And Black Pete, for those who aren't familiar, I estimate that he was the first Black Mormon convert. He was baptized in December of 1830, which I knew. And then he went on a mission for the Mormon Church in February of 1831. And I knew before this that it was likely, although they don't have any priesthood ordination certificates, but it's likely that he probably baptized people in Kirtland because, the church was 6 months old. They didn't have a lot of, structure that we have today. It wasn't like today. So I went in there knowing that, and I had planned on asking Mark about that in the podcast. And then Mark told me two things that blew my mind. Number one was that he believes that Black Pete introduced speaking in tongues into the Mormon church. And I was like, I never knew that.
That's interesting.
And I don't know. Yeah. And so the funny thing according to Mark, if this is true, that Black Pete introduced speaking in tongues, Joseph Smith came and said, I'm not a fan of that. But some of these missionaries from Kirtland went back east. I want to say Pennsylvania. I'm not sure exactly. I think that's where it was. Converted Brigham Young. Brigham Young came back to Kirtland and reintroduced speaking in tongues to the Kirtland congregation. So that was quite interesting. And then the other thing that he said was that Black Pete may have introduced polygamy. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So
that's big.
I actually asked Brian Hales about that. Brian doesn't necessarily agree, but he said, Mark's a smart guy. And so I walked away from that, just going, wow, this is amazing.
That's interesting.
And I thought I knew a lot about church history. So that was...
I mean, I've heard the Cockernites before, but I hadn't heard that about Black Pete.
Yeah. So I think Mark's in a little bit of the minority on that position, but, it was fascinating to hear that that's a possibility.
So let me toss out my most shocking moment from your podcast. It was the interview. It was the early interviews that you were doing during Black History Month. You were interviewing Paul Reeve, and Paul Reeve admitted that he was the one that wrote the Blacks in the Priesthood essay. That is the Gospel Topics essay. And,
yes.
And Rick, I think you and I and Brian, we all kind of run in the same circles, and we had heard Paul's name had been whispered for a long time, but I think that was the first time that it was on record that he wrote the Blacks in the Priesthood Gospel Topics essay.
Yes. I was surprised he actually answered that question. I expected more evasiveness there, but
And I think, if I remember correctly, didn't he say the original essay was like 56 pages or something like that? And they willed it down to 4 or something?
8. Yeah, I think he said the original essay was about 40 pages and they whittled it down to 8.
Yeah.
So, I was just going to say, they cut it out quite a bit.
Yeah, well, and I think that's that's the crazy thing about interviewing people is I don't fault reporters, whether they be news reporters or sports reporters, for asking the question that you are probably expecting not to get an answer on, because you never know. You just never know if someone's just going to open it up. And I think the way that he opened it up, like, yeah, it was me. Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's what I did. It was this, and it was like, whoa, you just did that.
Yeah, I felt like that was quite a scoop. I was pretty excited about that.
So, okay, so this is such a cliched question, but just if you had the option, so you've interviewed a lot of people. I will give you a lot of credit, because I think in your interviews, because you're spanning a lot of different timeframes and going into a lot of different areas, I actually think that's tough to do, and it really shows that you do a lot of good research and ask good questions. But if you had the option to interview anyone from Mormonism, alive or dead, who would it be? And let's get it out of the way in the beginning. Joseph Smith's not an answer. Like, that's way too easy. So if you could interview anybody, whether it's for their candidness or for their stories or whatever, who would it be?
Well, right now, I've actually talked to Richard Bushman. I haven't been able to work that out. So he's probably my number one that I haven't gotten so far. I did just talk to Michael Quinn a week or two ago. So I can put him away. He'll be a future interview. So we'll save that for a little bit.
Mike's great. We had him on the show. What was it, a month ago?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He's great to talk to, isn't he?
Yeah, he's awesome.
I'm digging his new book too. I think he did a great job.
Yeah.
So, and I'll just throw out this teaser. So I said, honestly, his book's pretty short, especially compared to some of his other ones. It's got like 3 chapters and then 21 appendixes, right? Yeah, and so I was just kind of flipping through there, and I said, Deseret Hemp Company. Is that what I think it is?
Right.
We had a fun little conversation about that.
we had legal marijuana before it was cool.
That's right. Church sponsored.
So you mentioned Richard Bushman. You mentioned that you just interviewed Mike Quinn. Anyone else that you would sit there and go, man, alive or dead, anyone that you're just like, I got to get with them?
I've been pretty lucky. I've interviewed Brian Hales, I've interviewed Ugo Perego, Simon Southerton. I even got Sandra Tanner. We talked a little bit about the Mark Hoffman thing. So, trying to have a broad spectrum. So, yeah,
it would have been Bruce. It would have been Bruce Armacon.
Well, you know who's somebody who I really think's probably going to say no, but I would really like to interview. Dallin Oakes wrote a fantastic book back, I want to say it's in the 70s, on
Carthage
Conspiracy. I don't think he would ever say yes, but, Elder Oakes, if you're out there.
He wrote that with Marvin Hill.
Yeah, if you're out there, I would really love to talk to you about that book, because I think it's a fantastic book, and it really, it kind of dispels a lot of the Mormon myths. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that I enjoy doing. I interviewed my namesake, Dr. Richard Bennett at BYU, and we discussed the story about the crushing up the plates in the china, and he said, yeah, that's not true. I let my mom listen to me to that interview, and she goes, "That's true, I swear it is."
I know. So can I just tell you real quick, Rick? Mm-hmm. So in the summer of 2014, I went out to Nauvoo, and I gave I started working for the Community of Christ out there in the Joseph Smith Historic Site as a research fellow, and I was giving site tours, and it's 95% LDS groups that come out there for their religious tourism. And I was asked by one group, if you had a little bit extra time, I would say, hey, if you have any extra questions or whatever, throw out, just feel free to. And one of them asked about that story. Now, this is Nauvoo, not Kirtland, but they'd just come from Kirtland. So Kirtland was still on their mind. And they asked about that story, and they said, what do you think? And I said, it's not true. And the look on this poor lady's face, she was so upset because she said, that's what they told me out there. The site people at the Kirtland Temple, that's what they told me out there. And she goes, I've heard this story my entire life because I had a descendant, or an ancestor in Kirtland. I'm a descendant of somebody from Kirtland, and this has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And now you're telling me that this isn't true. And I said, well, I mean, it's not a terrible story, right? I mean, they went around and collected all the pre-broken plates and asked for donations.
I mean, there's an element of truth to it. Yeah.
Right. It's not like it's an awful story that just was completely made up out of nowhere. But the whole idea that these women gave up their best china, part of it is the folklore. But it kind of also taught me a lesson that people really cling to their folklore.
Right. Yeah, my mom was almost felt disappointed.
Bad. Yeah. I almost felt like I told her, that Santa wasn't real or something.
That's right. Yeah. It's kind of funny how that works. But
so Ricky, you had mentioned that you like looking into Mormon myths. What are some of your favorite Mormon myths that you like looking into? And I guess I would say this: what is your favorite Mormon myth to bust?
This one's a little bit of a sacred cow. I don't know if I should even say, but
now you got to say it.
Yeah. So
lead it like that.
One of the things that one of my big favorite topics is the priesthood ban. It's really one of my favorite topics. I love doing that. In fact, I've already got several interviews that I'll be releasing probably next year on that topic. And the myth that God inspired the priesthood ban, I just wish we would shoot that in the head. I think that it's horrible. It's just a horrible thing. And I mean,
we're trying though, right? We're kind of trying to kill it.
Well, we're trying. There's been some people. Andrew at Wheaton Terrace kind of has done some stuff on that, where you can read the Gospel Topics essay that Paul Reeve wrote that we know now. Or I should be careful. Paul participated in that. He doesn't like to say that he wrote it.
Yeah. So just real quick before I let you finish what you're saying. So I was there at the church history department on a 2-year internship while those were being drafted. I knew all along that Paul was involved, but man, I'm telling you, by the time that it got through correlation and edits and rewrites and paring downs and then sending over to the quorum for their thoughts on it and then rewrites, and by the time it actually came out the end, it was kind of like, I don't know, a sausage grinding effect.
That's what
right. Like you just put in whatever meat you want on the one side and it all comes out sausage on the other. Right. So
and I mean, that's what Andrew said. You can read that and say, oh, well, God inspired that. And then somebody else can read it and say, no, God had nothing to do with that. And that's kind of what they've done. I mean, I've talked to Paul, Paul, I think, well, Paul said, just read my book. That's what I really think. But,
Right.
I mean, he pins that basically on a lot of 19th century attitudes about race. And so,
And
I don't
fear of
think
miscegenation, right? So
exactly that's a big part of
I
it.
think that was a really big one, the whole fear of interracial marriage.
Yeah. And so the problem with the essay is you can read it from any point of view and be like, oh, yeah, God inspired it or God didn't inspire it. And I wish it was just a little bit more, and I don't blame Paul at all. Like you said, it went through a big editing process. And I mean, I understand that the leaders, they don't want to throw any previous prophet under the bus. But that racial crap just needs to go. It just needs to go.
Well, and Brian brought up a thing. Do you think the attitude has changed? Do you think people are? Well, so I don't know if my own biases are being clouded, both on my own personal feelings about the racial ban and also the fact that I live in Southeast Michigan. So we have a pretty heavy African American population in Southeast Michigan. So some of the attitudes about the priesthood ban, they don't fly here because you're going to have to look at black people in the face and say that it doesn't fly here, right?
Right.
But I'm trying to, I don't know, from both of your perspectives, are we getting better at how do I phrase this? Like not continually trying to defend it and just acknowledging, yeah, it wasn't a good thing, everybody.
Baby steps.
Yeah. I mean, but on the other hand, Brant and I were talking about how the gospel topics essays are starting to make an appearance more and more in the local ward setting. And, I had an experience not too long ago with our Sunday school president teaching in the ward Sunday school council, I guess is what they call it. And he brought up the gospel topics essays, and he was talking about some of the specific topics that they cover and some of the framing that we've always had that's now being, adjusted because of them, highly, admonishing them for teachers to use them where appropriate. And at the end of the class, I came up to him and said, well, I'm so happy that you did this. How did you find out about the gospel topics essays? And he said, oh, it's in the manual. So
go figure. Amazing. It's in the manual.
Right. So we're getting there, right? I mean, like little things here and there, and I know that there's framing problems with how the essay came out, and people can debate that, but we're talking about it, right?
I mean, at least there's something to start from.
Yeah, not in my word, I have to say though.
As in, like they're not talking about it, or they are talking about it extensively.
No, they're not talking about it in my word.
Yeah, maybe your Sunday school president needs to be shown where in the teacher's correlation handbook that they have, where in that handbook they tell him to talk about the essays.
I think they just don't want to. I don't know. They don't want to address it.
They're bell ringers, right? That's what they want to do. They just want to ring the bell when class time is over.
Ring the bell and make sure that everyone's got a teacher, and hope and pray that the gospel talking teacher shows up or something like that.
Right. Yeah, they're more concerned about that.
So Rick, you mentioned that you actually do some really long interviews with all of your guests, but I've noticed that your podcast episodes are only 10 to 15 minute segments. What was the thought behind doing it that way?
Well, yeah, once again, so I listened to a lot of other podcasts. And so right before I was getting ready to launch, honestly, this is probably a weird thing about me, but I'm actually a drone pilot. And so if there are any drone pilot listeners out there, there's a great one called Ask Drone U, and it's a couple of guys in New Mexico that they actually have a call-in show and say, hey, record a question, we'll answer it. And it's just
Rick,
fantastic.
You're a drone pilot?
Yeah, I know.
Hold on. I've seen those drones. They're like, maybe like 3 feet wide. How do you get into one of those things? You got to be really small.
Yeah, they're really small. Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh, yeah. Brian, your dad jokes are awful.
They're pretty hard. I'm a big guy too, so no.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just couldn't. You couldn't put that out there and not have me, lob a good dad joke at that.
Yeah, so I keep my feet firmly on the ground. I am FAA certified pilot, by the way, so if anybody wants to hire me out there. So they talk all about certification, and every one of their podcasts, I won't say everyone, but they keep them all 10 to 20 minutes. And when I started listening, I was like, what did they call that? Binge listen, where I would listen to just episode after episode because I was just learning so much. And I thought, this is great. 10 to 20 minutes, that's perfect. And so I've kind of tried to emulate that. And because, John Dehlin, honestly, he did a great job at first, but his podcasts are too long.
Who?
And yeah,
I've never heard of him. I'm pretty sure that you and the Mormon News Report are the only Mormon themed podcast out there. Am I right?
No. Well, and the Cultural Hall, Brian. Don't forget the Cultural Hall.
Oh, yeah, of course, the Cultural Hall. Yes, our sponsoring podcast. That's the third podcast that's out there.
Yeah. So anyway, I tried to keep it so that if you have a short commute, my commute. I also work at Utah Valley University, so I'll throw that out there too. And and I will listen to my podcast on my way to work, and it's great. It's about a 15-minute drive, and
flying
I can usually listen to the whole thing on the way. So I'm not a drone pilot there, but I'm actually a statistics teacher. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, I want to thank you for coming on the show. This has been a fascinating interview. I really highly recommend everyone checking out the Gospel Tangents podcast. Rick, I actually do what you do with your podcast. What I do is I let it build up, and then I just binge it all on a weekend or something like that when I'm out cutting my grass or doing whatever. And so if you like it in short little snippets, boom, he's got you covered there. Or if you're someone like me, you want to get everything out in one shot, he does it that way as well. The Gospel Tangents podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, and you can also purchase the transcripts from Amazon or his website. You can check out his website, gospeltangents.com. You could search for Gospel Tangents on Facebook, or you can find him on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Thanks for coming on, Rick. We really appreciate it, and we'll be right back.